Hello, ENVS 319. I am Gigi Berardi, and I am going to guide us through the assignments and for this week. And I want to say that I just released the grades on your reading notes, and I am so impressed with your questions for discussion. So be sure to include at least 3 questions for discussion. And I actually very glibly attempted to answer all the questions. So that is like 100 questions. So those were just like rough thoughts. They weren't meant to be definitive answers, but that was to say, that I was super impressed with how deep your questions were, and sad that we're not going to have face-to-face time to discuss them, but we will get to some of them on Friday for those of you who are able to join us or who are looking at the recording after the session. So thank you for taking those assignments seriously. For this week, I am going to start with our rules for writers. I know a few of you are using the online version of Hacker and Summers. And so you had 2 separate readings, and I know the notes are due tomorrow. As I said, today is April 14th. And the first section that you're reading is called the writing process. And the second is on the research process. So in terms of the writing process, it starts with, on page 2, it starts with be curious, be engaged, be responsible, be reflective. It doesn't say be right, nor does it say be perfect. And that is one of the main messages of this class. Don't worry about perfection. Don't sacrifice good enough because you can't have perfection. Another way of saying that is, do not procrastinate. So just write. Because if you don't write, you won't be able to edit. And the grade in this class is based not on writing, but on editing. Because our main objective is clarity. To be the clearest writers we can possibly be. And that's not possible unless we submit work early so that we have enough time to edit. Or I should say revise and edit. Revise is the kind of the big picture, the big ideas that get shifted around that you play with. And then editing is kind of the line by line editing. And we'll talk about that distinction more later in the course. But this is why we don't have many lectures in class either, because you can't teach how to begin writing. You just have to begin writing. And nor can you teach the motivation to edit, except by making an assignment that gets graded. So you need to just do it. Just do the resume. Just write the cover letter. Just write the essay proposal. Just write the essay and start the process, right? So it is a process. So that is discussed in Hacker. And they talk about assessing the writing situation, your subject, your purpose, your audience. For the resume and cover letter assignment, your audience is your employer. If you don't have an employer, you're going to find one to make it up. Why should you make it up? You should make it up because that'll make the difference between a 6-hour assignment and a 2-hour assignment. It'll be quicker once you have an employer or an internship supervisor in mind. So I gave some suggestions that are all in Canvas as to where to look to get your made-up job if you're really not thinking about a specific job right now, which is completely understandable. Okay, and these first 49 pages or text, if you're online, are pretty specific. And so it helps you in producing drafts. Now, as I said before in an earlier video, we don't do drafts in class as assignments. The draft is something you do at home before the assignment is actually due. So the assignments that we're seeing, the resume and cover letter and the essay, I would imagine is the result of 5 or 6 or 7 drafts you've already done. Because otherwise, how is it going to be at a stage for you to edit? All right, so that's why we try and avoid the word draft. So the drafts you're doing for yourself to get a nice product to hand in this class are discussed. How to do that in Hacker and Summers. And then also discussed is the revising, editing, and reflecting process, although we're going to help you with that part. We can't help you with the writing part. You just have to do it. So looking forward to those submissions at 11:59 tomorrow night. The second bit of reading was in Hacker and Summers was on pages, anyway, was the section entitled Research. Thinking like a researcher, gathering sources, and we're going to talk about this more next week. Managing information, evaluating sources. Why do you have this book as a textbook? You have it as a textbook because we'd like you to follow the suggestions in sections 50 and 51 and 52. That is the section, the larger section on research that begins with thinking like a researcher and gathering sources. So this really is a wonderful reference book. Okay, Koki. All right. So often in class, we play a game much like Iron Chef, where I'm the Iron Chef. And people try and stump me with research topics and maybe even jobs and writing a resume. And I whip out a resume, give a cover letter pretty quickly, example. Or for the essay, write the first paragraph of the introduction. How can I do that? Because I know the basic structure of what's required for the resume, the cover letter, and the essay. Make sure you understand the structure of what's required for the resume, the cover letter, and the essay, especially the assignment later in the course. How are you going to do that? You're going to do it, try and understand by looking at all the materials in Canvas, which are there, and especially all the examples. So we're getting a couple of assignments, a couple of submissions from people that have like, I don't know, 6 lines of reading notes. And I'm thinking, did this person look at the example? So please look at the examples. We will hand your assignments back, metaphorically. That is, we won't grade them if they're not following the instructions. How do you know what the instructions are? They're in Canvas. Or, in a pinch, just look at the examples. Okay. The essay. So a good situation with that is to look at the essay, the KK essay, and we have permission to use Kelsey's name in Canvas for this week. That is a fairly dense, beautifully written essay. It really wasn't her essay 1, it was her essay 2. It was the revised essay. And she's looking at a concept. She's looking at one person in particular. You know, does your essay have to be on one person? No, not exactly. It can be on a concept, an idea, and you are all off to a good start because you've got a great understanding of geography. You understand that geography in the Creswell readings is a placeholder. It's a placeholder for, in a sense, it is, for all social sciences, basically all sciences. Because what Creswell is saying and kind of the postmodern take on scholarship is that science is created, not discovered, and people have agendas. But it's not even as simple as, oh, people have political agendas, so science is political. That's really like pretty easy to understand, and you don't need a dense thinker and writer like Creswell, do you, to lead you through that kind of thinking. What he's saying actually is that people don't realize the frameworks in which they're operating: a racial framework, a racist framework, a sexist framework, a capitalistic framework. So Creswell almost follows in the tradition of what we call postmodernists. Livingstone, definitely, when you get to him. And anyway, this writing is fairly dense. Creswell, even in Kelsey's essay, because she's kind of using that epistemology, that way of knowledge, that scientific approach that Creswell uses in giving in this potted history of geography and all sciences. Many of you have the same discussion questions, I should say. Is the classic geography, classic questions, classic text relevant today? That was a common question. Really, your questions were quite sophisticated. Yes, relevant, scholars would say. And particularly if you're interested in alternative epistemologies, alternative science is. So then I ask you to look at that owl.purdue.com site because it's so good for writing help. So I'm just following in Canvas right now for week 2. That's what we're in right now, week 2. And then the environmental science writing guidelines for technical writing and elegant prose. I actually put that together with Rebecca Pachi Green, and those pointers are really important in the first 7 pages or so that document environmental science writing for our writing guide for technical writing and elegant prose. So in there is how to write a good introduction. That introduction that I see for essay 1 in like week 7 should have been written last. And if you did not rewrite the introduction for your essay after you have written the entire paper, so rewrite the introduction. Actually, we'd better not to do an introduction at all until after you've written the entire paper. I will know. Why? Because the introduction will be rambling. So in this guideline, it talks about having a non-rambling introduction, which includes a roadmap. I call it a blueprint, the blueprint, but roadmap is good, probably better. It's the same thing. The roadmap says what you're going to do. You're going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to do this, then next you're going to talk about. That's the roadmap. And we'll talk about it a lot in this class. Then paragraphs. Paragraphs have to have a clear topic sentence. So for your cover letter, which is due soon, you want to have really clear paragraphs with a topic sentence. So the first sentence of each paragraph announces what the topic is for that paragraph. So your paragraph structure needs to be good. In the paper, at least, you'll be citing evidence, and it's probably a good idea to include sections. So the two major assignments for this class are the resume and the cover letter, which is due this week, and the essay. So we're kind of talking about both at the same time, although you're most interested in the cover letter and resume, I'm sure. Okay, then we have Goff and Sullivan research proposals, very important. So their topics are completely different. JMO's is like, what's the deal with biochar? That's how all of our essays and research start. What's the deal? Michael Medler talks about this in our department. What's the deal with biochar? Do biochar amendments affect fungal biota and dynamics? That's what he's looking at. Kay is looking at something completely different. She's looking at constructs, which she has uncovered. So socioeconomic wealth, civic agriculture, social capital, and she's looking at how one particular farmer, so she has a case study, JMO has an experimental research design, but she's trying to find some kind of approximation of truth here regarding how is it that small farms can survive. And she is positing that social capital, socioeconomic wealth, and civic agriculture are going to be evident. And her question is asking how so in the case of this one particular farmer in Snohomish County. And it's fascinating to see how they've actually structured the research. Hopefully we'll be able to get them on for our discussion on Friday. Creswell. Okay. So here are my reading notes, which you probably, I know you can't see. Those are my reading notes on Creswell. So in the first few chapters, he really looks at what it means to be a geographer, but he's really asking what does it mean to be a social scientist? And really he's asking what does it mean to be a scientist? He talks a lot about theory, and somebody said, this was so dense. What do you think his main point was? You know what? I am not sure. I completely agree with you. We're on the same page here. So what I do when I'm reading Creswell is I just substitute the word philosophy. Theory is a little grandiose. Central place theory, which is arduous and contested in geography. Social theory, I would take theory to mean some bigger idea. Some bigger idea. And in the essays, you will need to talk about a research question, an idea you have in the context of some bigger idea. Does that have to be a theory? No. But some bigger idea. And you will get that comment from JMO and myself and any other faculty member ever, probably, because we've all been trained a certain way, that your research question should relate to some bigger idea. All right, so I'm with you about theory and also on jargon, his use of jargon, and that's very POMO, that's very postmodern. Really the crux of what he's getting at though is epistemology, is how do we know what we know? What are different ways of knowing? And we'll talk about this more later in the class, and you picked up on it in your discussion questions. He definitely talks about the history of the discipline. He says, knowing something of the past of our discipline prevents us from reinventing the wheel in terms of scholarship. Then he talks about classic geography, which you were very interested in, and medieval geography. I myself am writing on this very subject of medieval geography and the mysticism and alchemy of the time. It's fascinating. He talks about Johannes Vermeer, who painted The Geographer, which is classic, and is the icon, the thumbnail for our canvas. And that geographer in the picture, in the image, is thinking and doing. He's thinking and he is map making. Happens to be a younger white man. This field, as it is often recounted, is dominated by older white men. Chapter 3 is the emergence of modern geography. That's what you're working on now. And Cresswell talks about Kant's ontology, with physical geography providing the basis for all other geographies. So there was a fascination with more traditional science in the form of physical geography, testable science, if you will, which is arguable, but anyway, in the form of physical geography. What is reality? Kant was asking, and Cresswell's asking, and most of the people highlighted in this text. What is reality when everything is socially produced? Everything is created. He begins with Humboldt into the 19th century, who was a public intellectual. He talks about deductive versus inductive reasoning, and deductive reasoning is more what we're familiar with. It's really the scientific method, this idea of making precise observations to disprove theories, versus inductive, where you start big, you start with a theory. You could argue that this was typical of medieval geography, I guess, where you're starting big, you're starting with God. Doesn't get bigger than that. Everything relates to what they were calling God, and everything can be explained in reference to the deity. Cresswell discusses Darwin versus Lamarck. Darwin used an idea about natural selection and improving genetics as a result of successive generations, individuals surviving to produce the next generation and to disseminate their genetic print, versus Lamarck, who said that characteristics could be acquired. So if you lived in mountain passes and you were a thief, you would have longer hands so you could steal things better. That would be Lamarck. I'm not kidding. Mackinder, the first chair of geography at Oxford, was into geopolitics. So it is he who said, "Who rules the East Europe commands the heartland. Who rules the heartland commands the world island. Who rules the world island commands the world," establishing Great Britain as a world power, a maritime power, a colonizing power. Then he talks about Friedrich Ratzel and Ellen Semple, and Ratzel's idea of Lebensraum, which is related to manifest destiny, which is the kind of carte blanche to the ticket to kind of dominate the world. So whoever is the colonizing power, needs space to colonize, to dominate. William Morris Davis is known for geomorphology, maybe the father of geomorphology, so-called. But what Cresswell is saying is that Darwin definitely had an influence. It's just an idea which has since been disproven, many of these ideas. But William Morris Davis was fascinated by evolution, which shows in his work. Then environmental determinism. Okay. We'll talk about this more later because it's had such an effect on geography, on social sciences. and on environmental sciences. He mentions Ellsworth Huntington, the character of races, in 1927, but all before Huntington was also environmental deterministic too. Environmental determinism dripping with racism. I'm sure you were able to pick up on that in the reading. Anarchist geography, yeah, Antipode is all about how the world works. How do we know what we do? And also, how can we change it? And so we look to Berkeley, the Berkeley geographers for that, where Antipode was born, the Journal of Radical Geography, and then also Clark University too, for example. Okay, that's a potted version of Cresswell. And I'm glad you're getting a lot out of it. And I am enjoying looking at your discussion threads. I fear how long it's going to take to process this Zoom video. All right, so anyway, enjoy your work on the resume and cover letter.